The roar of thunder masked the alarming crack as the riverbank began to give way beneath Nora Ellis's modest cabin. April 1875 had brought 3 straight weeks of rain to Monticello, Utah Territory, transforming the typically gentle San Juan River into a monstrous force of nature. Nora pressed her face against the rain-spattered window, her green eyes widening in horror as she watched the muddy waters rise inch by inch up her porch steps. "Sweet, merciful heaven," she whispered, clutching her father's pocket watch to her chest. At 23, Nora had weathered many storms alone since her parents' passing 2 years prior, but nothing like this. The cabin shuddered as debris slammed against its foundation, and she stumbled backward, knocking over the kerosene lamp that provided her only light. Outside, rain pelted the earth with unforgiving fury. 10 miles away, Preston Walker urged his exhausted horse forward through the downpour. At 26, the cowboy had seen his share of flash floods in the Utah Territory, but the way the San Juan had risen sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with his soaked clothing. "Come on, Mercury," he urged his gray stallion. "Just a bit further." Preston had been working as a ranch hand at the Double Creek Ranch for the past 3 years. The owner, Henry Benson, had sent him to check on the widow Ellis, whose cabin sat precariously close to the river bend. Old man Benson had promised her late father to keep an eye on her. "She's stubborn as they come, Walker," Benson had told him, handing him a rain slicker that proved woefully inadequate against the torrential downpour. "Won't leave that cabin her pa built with his own hands, but if this rain keeps up, she won't have a choice." The closer Preston rode, the worse things looked. The normally dusty trail had disappeared beneath rushing water, forcing Mercury to wade through increasingly treacherous terrain. When the bend in the river came into view, Preston felt his heart drop. Water swirled violently around Nora's cabin, which now stood like a fragile island in a raging sea. "Miss Ellis," he shouted, though his voice was swallowed by the storm. "Nora Ellis." Inside the cabin, Nora frantically gathered what precious few items she could carry: her mother's wedding ring, her father's pocket watch, and the family Bible containing the only photographs she possessed. The water had breached the doorway, soaking the hand-woven rug her mother had made. The cabin groaned as the foundation shifted beneath her feet. Preston dismounted at the highest ground he could find, tethering Mercury to a sturdy juniper. The horse whinnied nervously, sensing his master's fear. Preston removed his boots and gun belt, keeping only his knife strapped to his calf. Without hesitation, he waded into the frigid water, gasping as the current immediately tried to sweep his legs from under him. "Miss Ellis," he called again, pushing forward as the water rose to his waist. "Nora!" Nora heard her name through the cacophony of rain and rushing water. She rushed to the window, clutching her small bundle of possessions. Through the sheets of rain, she could make out a figure struggling against the current toward her cabin. Recognition dawned as lightning flashed, illuminating the determined face of Preston Walker. "Mr. Walker," she gasped. She had only spoken to the tall, broad-shouldered cowboy a handful of times when delivering eggs to the Double Creek Ranch. He had always been polite but reserved, tipping his hat and offering a quiet "madam" before returning to his work. The cabin shuddered again, more violently this time. A horrible splintering sound came from below as part of the foundation gave way. Nora screamed, dropping to her knees as the entire structure tilted several inches toward the river. Preston saw the cabin shift and redoubled his efforts, now swimming against the powerful current. The cold numbed his limbs, but adrenaline drove him forward. Debris scraped against him: branches, fence posts, and other remnants of homesteads upstream that had already succumbed to the flood. With a final burst of strength, he reached the porch and hauled himself up. The wood creaked ominously beneath him. "Miss Ellis," he pounded on the door. "You need to come out now." The door flew open, revealing Nora's pale, terrified face. Her auburn hair had come loose from its usual tidy bun, cascading around shoulders draped in a woolen shawl. In her arms, she clutched a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice trembling. "The cabin it's going to, I know," he said, extending his hand. "We need to leave now." As if to emphasize his point, the cabin lurched again. The floor beneath them slanted further, and a window shattered as the frame twisted. "There's no time to waste," Preston said urgently. "The river's still rising." Nora hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His fingers were strong and sure around hers, despite the cold water dripping from both of them. "Can you swim?" he asked, leading her to the edge of the porch. "Yes, but stay close to me. The current's strong." He secured her bundle inside his shirt, making sure it wouldn't be lost in the water. "When I say go, take a deep breath and hold tight to my belt." Nora nodded, her teeth chattering from fear and cold. Preston's steady gaze calmed her slightly. She had always thought his eyes were remarkable, the color of summer sky, striking against his sun-darkened skin. Another groan from the cabin's foundation made the decision for them. "Now!" Preston shouted. Together, they plunged into the churning water. The cold shock stole Nora's breath, but she gripped Preston's belt with determined fingers. The current immediately swept them downriver, away from the cabin. Preston's powerful strokes fought against the flow, angling them toward the higher ground where Mercury waited. Behind them, a terrible cracking sound rose above the storm. Nora turned in time to see her childhood home tear away from what remained of its foundation. The cabin tilted, then collapsed, splintering as it was dragged into the river's grasp. "No!" She cried out, momentarily losing her grip on Preston. The current caught her, pulling her away from him. Panic seized her as water closed over her head. She flailed, disoriented in the murky depths, lungs burning for air. Then strong arms encircled her waist, pulling her upward. They broke the surface together, Nora gasping and coughing. "I've got you," Preston said, his voice calm despite the exertion evident in his labored breathing. "Just hold on." For what seemed like an eternity, they battled the flood. Preston never loosened his hold on Nora, even as branches and other debris struck him. Finally, his feet touched ground solid enough to stand on. With his remaining strength, he half carried, half dragged Nora to where Mercury nervously pawed the muddy earth. They collapsed on the soggy ground, both breathing heavily. Rain still pelted them, but they had reached safety. Nora looked back toward where her cabin had stood. Nothing remained but churning water. "Everything," she whispered. "Everything is gone." Preston rose to his knees beside her, retrieving her bundle from inside his shirt. Miraculously, the oilcloth had kept its contents dry. "Not everything," he said, handing it to her. Tears mixed with the rain on Nora's face as she clutched the small package to her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You risked your life for me." Preston looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said firmly. "They wouldn't have." She reached out, touching his arm. "Thank you, Mr. Walker." He nodded once, then got to his feet, offering her his hand. "We need to get to higher ground. The storm's not over." Nora allowed him to help her up, suddenly aware of how cold she was. Her dress, heavy with water, clung to her body and she couldn't stop shivering. Preston removed his wet coat and draped it over Mercury's saddle. "He can carry us both a short distance. There's a lined shack about 3 miles from here. We can shelter there until the storm passes." He lifted Nora onto Mercury's back with ease, then mounted behind her. The warmth of his chest against her back provided some relief from the cold, though both were thoroughly soaked. Preston kept one arm around her waist to steady her as he guided Mercury up the muddy slope. "I'm sorry about your home," he said as they picked their way through the stormy landscape. "I know how much it meant to you." Nora stared ahead, too numb with shock and cold to cry anymore. "My father built it when he married my mother. Every board, every nail." She shook her head. "I shouldn't have stayed. I knew the river was rising, but I couldn't bear to leave." "Home means something," Preston said simply. "No shame in wanting to protect it." They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the pounding rain and Mercury's labored breathing as he navigated the treacherous terrain. Nora felt herself leaning more heavily against Preston, exhaustion and cold seeping into her bones. "Stay awake, Miss Ellis," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "Not much further now." "Nora," she murmured. "After what you did today, I think you should call me Nora." His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Nora," he said, as if testing the feel of her name on his tongue. "Stay with me, Nora. Look, there it is." Through the curtain of rain, she could make out the dark shape of a small structure nestled against a rocky outcropping. The line shack was little more than a single room with a sod roof, but to Nora, it looked like salvation. Preston dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. Her legs buckled as her feet touched the ground, and he caught her against his chest. "Sorry," she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. "Nothing to be sorry for," he replied, supporting her weight as they made their way to the shack's door. Inside, the shack was spare but dry. A small cast iron stove sat in one corner and a narrow cot occupied another. Shelves held basic provisions: coffee, beans, flour, and other staples. Preston helped Nora to sit on a rough wooden chair before attending to Mercury, bringing the horse under the lean-to attached to the shack's side. When he returned, he immediately set about lighting the stove. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly, keeping his back to her as he worked. "There should be some spare clothes in the trunk. Nothing fancy, but they'll be dry." Nora looked to where he pointed, seeing an old wooden trunk beneath the single window. "I can't just—" "You can and you will," Preston said firmly, still not looking at her. "I've seen too many good people lost to lung fever. I'll step outside while you change." Before she could protest further, he was gone, closing the door firmly behind him. Nora sat motionless for a moment, then realized the sense in his words. She was chilled to the bone, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. With stiff fingers, she opened the trunk. Inside, she found men's clothing: shirts, trousers, and woolen socks, all clean but well worn. She selected the smallest shirt and pair of trousers she could find, along with thick socks. Peeling off her sodden dress and undergarments was a struggle, but the relief of dry clothing against her skin was immediate and profound. She used a length of rope from the trunk as a belt to keep the oversized trousers from slipping down. The shirt hung nearly to her knees. After wringing out her hair as best she could, she called, "You can come back in now, Mr. Walker." Preston re-entered, carrying an armload of firewood. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her in men's clothing, but he made no comment as he stoked the stove. Soon, a welcome warmth began to fill the small space. "Your turn," Nora said, gesturing to the trunk. "You're as wet as I was." Preston hesitated, then nodded. "I'll just—" He took some clothes from the trunk and stepped outside again. Alone, Nora unwrapped her bundle, relieved to find its contents had indeed remained dry. Her mother's wedding ring gleamed in the dim light, and the family Bible, while slightly damp at the edges, had protected the photographs tucked between its pages. Her father's pocket watch ticked steadily, its familiar sound comforting in the unfamiliar surroundings. When Preston returned, He had changed into dry clothes and carried their wet garments, which he hung on a line strung across one corner of the shack. His hair, usually hidden beneath his hat, curled damply against his neck, darker when wet but still the color of wheat. "Storm's easing some," he said, moving to the small stove. "But the water's still rising. We'll need to stay here tonight at least." Nora nodded, watching as he efficiently prepared coffee in a battered pot. His movements were economical, practiced. For the first time, she truly looked at the man who had saved her life. Preston Walker was tall, lean but muscular, with the kind of strength that came from daily labor rather than vanity. His face was handsome in a weathered-way strong jaw, straight nose, and those remarkable blue eyes beneath straight brows. A scar ran along his left jawline, thin and white against his tanned skin. His hands, as he worked, were calloused but gentle with the items he handled. "Thank you," she said suddenly. He glanced up, brows raised in question. "For coming for me," she clarified. "You could have been killed." Preston returned his attention to the coffee. "Mr. Benson asked me to check on you, simple as that." "It wasn't simple at all," Nora countered. "You swam through a flood to reach me. That goes beyond duty to an employer." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Let's just say I understand what it means to lose everything. Wouldn't wish that on anyone." Something in his tone stopped Nora from pressing further. Instead, she asked, "Have you worked for Mr. Benson long?" 3 years this June." Preston poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handing one to her. "Came west from Missouri after the war, needed a fresh start." Nora wrapped her cold hands around the warm cup. "You fought?" He nodded once, his expression closing. "Union, 4th Missouri Cavalry. My father supported the Union cause," Nora said softly. Though he was too old to enlist, Preston's shoulders relaxed slightly. He chose this remote place afterward. He had consumption. "The doctors said the dry air might help." Nora took a sip of the strong coffee. "It did for a while. He built our cabin, started a small vegetable garden. My mother and I tended chickens." Her voice caught. "They're all gone now too, I suppose." "Likely," Preston acknowledged, not offering false comfort. "But you're not." Outside, the rain continued to fall, though with less ferocity than before. Thunder rumbled in the distance, moving away. The stove crackled, its warmth gradually chasing the chill from Nora's bones. "What will you do now?" Preston asked, settling on a stool across from her. The question hit Nora with the force of a physical blow. In the rush of survival, she hadn't thought beyond the immediate danger. Now, the reality of her situation crashed over her. She was homeless, with only the clothes on her back and the few treasures she'd managed to save. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. "I have a little money saved from selling eggs and vegetables, perhaps enough for passage back east, where I have a cousin in Pennsylvania." The thought held little appeal. The East had never been home to her, and her cousin, while kind in letters, was a virtual stranger. "Monticello will rebuild," Preston said. "Folks there are stubborn, like you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Is that how you see me? Stubborn?" "Determined," he amended. "Standing your ground, that's not a bad quality." Nora looked down at her coffee. "Fat lot of good it did me today." "You survived," Preston said simply. "That's something." They fell into silence, listening to the rain and the crackling stove. Despite the warmth in the shack, exhaustion began to overtake Nora. Her eyelids grew heavy and she struggled to keep her head from nodding. "Take the cot," Preston said, noticing her fatigue. "You need rest." "Where will you sleep?" she asked, too tired to argue. He gestured to the floor near the stove. "I've slept in worse places." Nora wanted to protest that it wasn't proper, but propriety seemed a distant concern after all that had happened. She moved to the narrow cot, lying down on the rough blanket. "Wake me if anything changes." "I will," Preston promised. Despite her racing thoughts, sleep claimed Nora almost immediately. Her dreams were chaotic swirling water, her cabin splintering, her parents calling her name from somewhere she couldn't reach. Through it all ran a constant thread, strong arms holding her, keeping her from being swept away. Preston watched her sleep for a time, noting how the worry smoothed from her face, how young she looked in repose. He added wood to the stove, then spread his bedroll on the floor. Outside, the rain continued, but his trained ear detected its weakening intensity. By morning, it might stop altogether, though the flooding would take longer to recede. He thought of Nora's cabin, now gone, and the uncertain future she faced. Something about her stirred protective instincts he'd thought long buried. Perhaps it was her courage in the face of loss, something he recognized all too well. As he drifted toward sleep, Preston made a silent promise. Whatever came next, Nora Ellis wouldn't face it alone. Morning arrived with watery sunlight filtering through the shack's single window. Nora woke disoriented, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory rushed back: the flood, her cabin, Preston's rescue. She sat up quickly, looking around the small space. Preston was already awake, standing at the stove where a pot of something bubbled. He turned at her movement. "Morning," he said quietly. "How are you feeling?" Nora took stock of herself. Her body ached, especially her arms and legs, which had been strained beyond their usual exertion during the swim. But she was warm and dry and very much alive. "Sore," she admitted, "but well enough considering." Preston nodded. "Made some porridge, not fancy, but it's hot." Nora swung her legs over the side of the cot, suddenly self-conscious of her appearance. Her hair had dried in tangled waves, and the men's clothing hung awkwardly on her frame. Still, vanity seemed foolish under the circumstances. "Thank you," she said, accepting the bowl he offered. "Have you been outside yet? How does it look?" Rain stopped. River's still high, but it's no longer rising. Preston sat on his stool, balancing his own bowl on his knee. "Checked on Mercury too. He's tired but no worse for wear." They ate in companionable silence. Nora found herself studying Preston again in the clear morning light. There was a steadiness to him that she found reassuring, a quiet competence that had saved her life the day before. "What will happen now?" she asked. Preston set aside his empty bowl. "I'll ride back to the ranch, let Mr. Benson know what happened. He'll want to help, I'm sure." "You mean charity," Nora said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I mean neighbors looking out for each other," Preston corrected mildly. "That's how it works out here." "You'd do the same if roles were reversed." Nora couldn't argue with that. Her parents had raised her to help others whenever possible. She had nursed sick neighbors, shared vegetables from their garden, and taught the Johnson children to read when their mother fell ill. "I suppose you're right," she conceded. "It's just—" She gestured helplessly. "I've never been so dependent before." Understanding flickered in Preston's blue eyes. "Independence matters to you." "It's all I've had since my parents died," Nora said softly. "Managing on my own, making my own decisions, it gave me purpose." Preston rose, moving to the door. He opened it, letting fresh air and sunlight into the shack. Outside, the world was transformed. Water still covered much of the lower ground, but the sky was clear, a brilliant blue that matched Preston's eyes. "Come see something," he said. Nora joined him at the doorway. From their elevated position, they could see across the valley to where Monticello lay in the distance. The town itself sat on higher ground and appeared largely intact, though surrounded by floodwater. "People will rebuild," Preston said. "They always do, but no one does it entirely alone." Nora watched as a bird swooped low over the floodwaters, then rose again toward the mountains. "I suppose you're right. We should head to town," Preston said. Check on the damage, let folks know you're safe. I'm sure there are people worried about you." The thought of facing others, of explaining her recklessness in staying despite the warnings, filled Nora with dread. But Preston was right, there would be concern, and she owed it to her neighbors to ease their minds. "I can't go dressed like this," she said, gesturing to her borrowed clothes. "Your dress might be dry enough to wear now," Preston suggested. "Not comfortable maybe, but enough to get you to town. Mrs. Peterson at the general store will help you from there." Nora's dress, hung near the stove overnight, was indeed mostly dry, though wrinkled and stained with river mud. She changed behind a blanket Preston respectfully hung as a screen, grimacing at the feel of the still damp fabric against her skin. Her boots, too, were unpleasantly moist, but she had no alternative. When she emerged, Preston had already saddled Mercury and packed their few belongings. He offered no comment on her bedraggled appearance, simply helping her mount before swinging up behind her. The journey to Monticello was slow going. Mercury picked his way carefully around flooded areas, sometimes forced to detour when the trail disappeared beneath water. Preston kept one arm securely around Nora's waist, steadying her when the horse negotiated particularly difficult terrain. The physical closeness should have made Nora uncomfortable. Propriety dictated a certain distance between unmarried men and women. But after what they had been through together, such concerns seemed trivial. There was a comfort in Preston's solid presence at her back. In the sure way he guided his horse through the devastated landscape. As they approached Monticello, evidence of the flood's destruction became more apparent. Fences were down, outbuildings collapsed, livestock carcasses caught in tree branches. Yet the town itself, built on a rise, had fared better than the outlying homesteads. People moved about Main Street, assessing damage and beginning cleanup efforts. Heads turned as Preston and Nora rode in, and soon they were surrounded by townspeople. "Nora Ellis, thank the Lord." Mrs. Peterson rushed forward, her normally tidy appearance disheveled by the emergency. "We feared the worst when Jacob couldn't reach your cabin yesterday." Sheriff Tanner pushed through the crowd. "Miss Ellis, good to see you alive." His gruff tone couldn't hide his relief. He nodded to Preston. "Walker, Benson's been looking for you." "Had to take shelter at the line shack," Preston explained. "Miss Ellis's cabin was taken by the flood." A murmur went through the gathered crowd. Nora felt their gazes on her, some sympathetic, others curious. She straightened her spine, determined not to show weakness. "I'm grateful to Mr. Walker," she said clearly. "He risked his life to save mine." More murmurs, this time approving. Sheriff Tanner clapped Preston on the shoulder. "Good man, Walker. Not surprised." Mrs. Peterson took charge, gently pulling Nora from Preston's horse. "You come with me, dear. We'll get you cleaned up and properly dressed. I have a spare room you can use until things sort themselves out." Preston dismounted, his gaze meeting Nora's over Mrs. Peterson's head. "I need to report to Mr. Benson," he said, "but I'll check on you later if that's all right." Nora nodded, suddenly reluctant to part from him. "Thank you again, Mr. Walker, for everything." His expression softened briefly. "Preston," he corrected. "After what we've been through, I think you should call me Preston." A smile touched Nora's lips. "Preston," she agreed. Mrs. Peterson led Nora away, already planning aloud how to help her recover from her ordeal. Nora glanced back once to see Preston watching her go, his expression unreadable in the morning sunlight. The Peterson home stood on the highest part of Monticello, untouched by the flooding. Inside, Mrs. Peterson fussed over Nora providing a hot bath, clean clothes borrowed from her daughter, who was closer to Nora's size, and a hearty meal. "Such a blessing that Cowboy found you," Mrs. Peterson said as she poured Nora a cup of tea. Preston Walker's not one for much talk, but he's as reliable as they come." "He was very brave," Nora agreed, warming her hands on the teacup. "I owe him my life." Mrs. Peterson settled across from her, eyes kind but assessing. "And everything else is gone. The cabin, your belongings." "Everything except this." Nora touched the small bundle she'd kept with her. "My mother's ring, my father's watch, our family Bible. Preston helped me save them." "Well, that's something at least." Mrs. Peterson patted Nora's hand. "Don't you worry about a thing. The good Lord provides, and so do neighbors. We'll get you back on your feet." Nora smiled gratefully, though her heart ached at the thought of rebuilding her life from nothing. The cabin had been more than shelter. It had been her connection to her parents, the only home she'd known in the West. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Peterson continued. "My Emma is getting married next month and moving to her husband's farm in Colorado. Her position at the schoolhouse will need filling. You've got more education than most, and you've taught the Johnson children, haven't you?" Nora blinked in surprise. "Yes, but I've never taught formally." "Near enough," Mrs. Peterson said decisively. "I'll speak to Reverend Carter. He oversees the school committee. It would provide you a small salary and lodging in the teacherage behind the schoolhouse." The offer was unexpected but not unwelcome. Nora had enjoyed teaching the Johnson children, finding satisfaction in sharing knowledge and watching young minds develop. It would give her purpose, independence, and a roof over her head. "That's very kind," she said. "I would be grateful for the opportunity." Mrs. Peterson nodded, pleased. "That's settled then. Now you rest. Your body's been through an ordeal, even if your spirit is strong." Rest proved elusive, however. Though physically exhausted, Nora's mind raced with all that had happened and all that was yet to come. She sat by the window in Mrs. Peterson's guest room, watching as the town continued its cleanup efforts. Men cleared debris from the streets. Women distributed food to those displaced by the flood. Children carried smaller items or ran messages. A familiar figure caught her eye: Preston, leading Mercury down Main Street. Even from a distance, she could see the weariness in his posture, the slight favoring of one leg as he walked. Had he been injured during the rescue? The thought troubled her. He had shown no sign of pain during their ordeal. As if sensing her gaze, Preston looked up. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Nora raised her hand in greeting, and he tipped his hat in response before continuing on his way. That evening, as Nora helped Mrs. Peterson prepare supper, a knock came at the door. Mr. Peterson answered it, and Nora heard Preston's deep voice in the entryway. "Evening, sir. I was hoping to check on Miss Ellis if it's not too much trouble." "Not at all, Walker. Come in. Martha's just setting the table. You'll join us for supper." It wasn't a question, and Preston didn't refuse. He entered the kitchen, hat in hand, boots freshly cleaned of mud. His gaze found Nora immediately, relief evident in his eyes. "Miss Ellis, you're looking better." "As are you," she replied, noting he had changed into clean clothes and trimmed his beard. "Though you're limping." "Were you hurt yesterday?" Preston shook his head dismissively. "Old injury. Axe up in damp weather, that's all." Mrs. Peterson bustled forward. "Sit down, Mr. Walker. You've earned a hot meal and then some, from what I hear." The meal was simple but satisfying: roast chicken, potatoes, and canned vegetables from Mrs. Peterson's cellar stores. Conversation flowed easily, with Mr. Peterson providing updates on the flood damage and recovery efforts. "River's dropping already," he reported. "Another day or two we'll be able to reach most of the outlying homesteads, assess the full damage." "What about livestock?" Preston asked. "Benson's concerned about his herd." "Some losses, naturally, but not as bad as feared. Most ranchers moved their cattle to higher ground in time. Those who didn't." Mr. Peterson shrugged. "Nature's cruel sometimes." Nora listened quietly, eating little despite Mrs. Peterson's encouragement. Her thoughts kept returning to her cabin, to the garden she'd tended so carefully, to the cherry tree her father had planted that had just begun to bear fruit. After the meal, Mr. Peterson invited Preston to smoke on the porch while the women cleared the table. As Nora washed dishes, Mrs. Peterson spoke quietly. That young man rode all over creation today, helping wherever he was needed. Pulled the Miller boy from a collapsed shed, helped the Richardsons round up scattered cattle, and still found time to come check on you. Nora glanced out the window to where Preston stood on the porch, his profile illuminated by the setting sun. He's a good man. Indeed he is, Mrs. Peterson agreed. Keeps to himself mostly, but always there when needed. Came here from Missouri after the war, from what I hear. Never speaks of family. The information added to the picture Nora was forming of Preston Walker, a solitary man with hidden depths, who understood loss yet remained kind despite it. When the dishes were done, Nora joined Preston on the porch. The evening air was cool but pleasant after the day's warmth. "Mrs. Peterson says you've been helping all over town today," she said, standing beside him at the railing. "You must be exhausted." Preston shrugged. "No more than anyone else. Still, after yesterday, you should rest." He turned to look at her, his expression softening. "And you, how are you holding up?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, threatened to unravel Nora's carefully maintained composure. She looked away, blinking rapidly. "I'm managing," she said finally. "Mrs. Peterson has been very kind. She's even suggested I might take her daughter's position at the schoolhouse." "Teaching suits you," Preston said. "I've seen you with the Johnson children. You have patience." Nora was surprised by the observation. "You've noticed that?" A slight flush colored Preston's cheeks. "I notice things," he said simply. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. In the distance, the San Juan River continued its rush, though with less fury than the day before. "I wanted to thank you properly," Nora said at last, "for yesterday. Words seem inadequate, but I am truly grateful." Preston studied her face in the fading light. "You would have done the same for anyone else." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but that doesn't diminish what you did for me." She hesitated, then placed her hand lightly on his arm. "I won't forget it." His gaze dropped to her hand, then returned to her face. Something passed between them, an understanding, a connection forged through shared danger and survival. "I should go," Preston said, his voice slightly rough. "Early start tomorrow." Nora withdrew her hand. "Of course." "Will I see you again soon?" The question slipped out before she could consider its implications. Preston's eyes widened slightly, then crinkled at the corners as he smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Count on it," he said. "Good night, Nora." She watched him walk away, a curious warmth spreading through her chest despite all she had lost. "Good night, Preston," she whispered, though he was already too far to hear. The following days passed in a blur of activity. True to her word, Mrs. Peterson arranged a meeting between Nora and the school committee. Impressed by her education and demeanor, they unanimously offered her the teaching position beginning in the fall term. In the meantime, she would assist the current teacher, Emma Peterson, and prepare for her departure. The teacherage, a small, two-room structure behind the schoolhouse, would require some repairs before Nora could move in. Water had seeped under the door during the flood, warping the floorboards in the front room. When word spread of Nora's situation, volunteers quickly stepped forward to help with the necessary work. Preston came by whenever his duties at the Double Creek Ranch allowed. Sometimes he brought supplies donated by Mr. Benson, blankets, cookware, or canned goods. Other times he simply offered his labor, repairing the teacherage roof or replacing damaged window frames. "You don't have to do this," Nora told him one afternoon as he installed a new stovepipe. "You've already done more than enough." Preston paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "Doesn't feel that way to me." Something in his tone made Nora look at him more closely. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, adjusting his grip on his tools. "Just that. Helping each other, it's what makes life out here possible. Community." Nora smiled, recognizing that he was repeating the lesson he'd shared with her at the line shack. "You're right, of course. Still, I hope you know how much I appreciate all you've done." Preston nodded once, returning to his work with focused attention. Nora had noticed this about him, how he shied away from gratitude or praise, preferring to let his actions speak for him. As May turned to June, the landscape around Monticello recovered from the flood. New grass grew in areas where water had receded, and wildflowers bloomed with unexpected vigor, nourished by the unusual moisture. The town itself had largely returned to normal, though conversation still frequently turned to the Great Flood and its aftermath. For Nora, the loss of her cabin remained a raw wound. She had ridden out once with Sheriff Tanner to see the site, finding nothing but mud and scattered debris where her home had stood. The garden was washed away, the cherry tree gone. She had wept then, allowing herself the release she'd been denying. The sheriff had waited patiently, keeping a respectful distance until she composed herself. "Land's still yours," he'd said gruffly. "Deeds recorded at the county office if you ever want to rebuild." Nora had nodded, not trusting herself to speak. But as they rode back to town, she'd found herself imagining a new beginning, not a replication of what was lost, but something different, something hers. By mid-June, the teacherage was repaired enough for habitation. The town's women organized a pounding for Nora, each family contributing household goods, food, or small comforts to help her establish her new home. Mrs. Peterson donated curtains and bed linens. Mr. Jacobson from the general store provided a set of dishes, and Reverend Carter's wife gave her a handmade quilt. Nora was overwhelmed by the generosity, especially when Preston arrived leading a wagon containing a small pine dresser. "Mr. Benson had this in storage," he explained as he maneuvered it into her bedroom. "Said it was just gathering dust." Nora ran her hand over the simple but well-crafted piece of furniture. "It's perfect. Please thank him for me." Preston nodded, then hesitated, one hand resting on the dresser. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Found this at the Mercantile in Durango last week." He held out a small object wrapped in brown paper. Nora took it curiously, carefully unwrapping the package. Inside was a silver locket on a delicate chain, plain but elegant in its simplicity. "Preston," she breathed, looking up at him in surprise. "It's beautiful, but I can't accept such a gift." "It's not much," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "Just thought, well, you lost so many keepsakes. Thought you might like something to hold your parents' pictures from the Bible." The thoughtfulness behind the gift struck Nora more powerfully than its monetary value, that he had considered what would matter to her, what might bring her comfort. "Thank you," she said softly, closing her fingers around the locket. "I'll treasure it." Their eyes met, and in that moment Nora realized how much Preston Walker had come to mean to her in the weeks since the flood. He was no longer just her rescuer, but a friend, perhaps something more, though neither had spoken of such possibilities. The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Peterson calling from the front room, asking where Nora wanted the kitchen items arranged. With a small smile, Preston stepped back, allowing Nora to precede him from the bedroom. That evening, after everyone had gone and Nora was alone in her new home for the first time, she carefully cut small circles from the photographs in her Bible. Her mother's gentle face fit perfectly on one side of the locket, her father's stern but kind visage on the other. Around her neck, the locket rested just above her heart, a tangible reminder of what she'd lost and what remained. As she prepared for bed, Nora found herself drawn to the window, looking out toward the Double Creek Ranch where Preston would be finishing his evening chores. She touched the locket, thinking of his quiet strength, his understated kindness. For the first time since the flood, she felt a flutter of something like hope for the future. The summer brought scorching heat to Utah territory, a stark contrast to the sodden spring. Nora settled into her duties at the schoolhouse, assisting Emma Peterson with summer lessons while preparing for the fall term when she would take over completely. The work suited her, providing structure to her days and satisfaction in helping the children of Monticello advance their education. Preston continued to visit regularly, though his duties at the ranch kept him busy with summer grazing and preparations for the fall cattle drive. Sometimes he brought small gifts, wildflowers gathered on his ride to town, a book of poetry rescued from a traveling peddler, or once, a kitten from a litter born in the ranch barn. For company, he'd said gruffly when Nora expressed surprise at the mewing bundle he placed in her arms. And for mice. The kitten, whom Nora named Mercury after Preston's faithful horse, quickly adapted to life at the teacherage, providing both practical rodent control and affectionate companionship. As July progressed, whispers began to circulate through Monticello about Nora and Preston. Their friendship had not gone unnoticed, nor had the cowboy's particular attentiveness to the new schoolteacher. "He's sweet on you," Emma Peterson declared one afternoon as she and Nora organized school books for the coming term. "Half the town's talking about it." Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks. "We're friends," she said carefully. "He helped me when I lost everything. It's natural we'd form a connection." Emma gave her a knowing look. "Natural indeed, but it's more than gratitude that brings him to your door twice a week with some excuse or other." Nora couldn't deny there was truth to Emma's words. Preston did seem to find reasons to visit a loose shutter that needed fixing, news from town that couldn't wait, or simply passing by on his way elsewhere. And Nora found herself looking forward to those visits with increasing anticipation. "Has he declared himself?" Emma pressed, unable to contain her romantic curiosity. "No," Nora admitted, "and he may never do so. Preston is reserved, private." Emma snorted delicately. "He's a man is what he is. Sometimes they need a little encouragement." Nora changed the subject, unwilling to discuss her complicated feelings for Preston further. Yet Emma's words lingered in her mind. That Saturday, Preston arrived at the teacherage with his usual quiet knock. Nora opened the door to find him holding a fishing pole and creel. "Thought you might like some fresh trout for supper," he said, hat in hand. "If you'd care to join me at the river." The invitation surprised and pleased Nora. "I'd like that very much," she said. "Let me get my shawl." They walked together to a bend in the San Juan where Preston knew the fishing was good. The river had returned to its normal course, peaceful now where it had been so destructive months earlier. Nora found she could look at it without fear, though respect for its power remained. Preston proved to be a patient teacher, showing Nora how to bait her hook and cast her line. His hands were gentle as they guided hers, his voice low and encouraging when she made mistakes. By mid-afternoon, they had caught 4 good-sized trout, enough for a hearty supper. They cleaned the fish by the riverbank, Preston demonstrating the technique with practiced ease. As they worked, Nora gathered her courage to ask something that had been on her mind. "Preston," she began, keeping her eyes on the fish she was scaling, "why did you really come to check on me that day?" During the flood, his hands stilled momentarily, then resumed their work. "Told you. Benson asked me to." Yes, but Nora set down her knife, turning to face him. You could have reported back that the cabin was surrounded by water, that it was too dangerous to reach. No one would have blamed you. Preston was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the river. Lost my family in a flood, he said finally, his voice so low Nora had to lean closer to hear. Back in Missouri, 61 before I enlisted. Spring rains washed out our farm. I was in town when it happened. My parents, my little sister. By the time I got back, it was too late. Understanding dawned. So when you saw my cabin, couldn't let it happen again, Preston said simply. Not if I could help it. Nora felt tears prick her eyes. I'm so sorry about your family. Preston nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. Been a long time. Is that why you came west after the war? Too many memories in Missouri? Partly. He began packing the cleaned fish in his creel, his movements methodical. War changed things too, changed me. Needed a fresh start somewhere new. Nora studied his profile, the straight nose, the firm jaw, the eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone still young. On impulse, she reached out, her hand covering his where it rested on the creel. I'm glad you came to Utah, she said softly. Selfish as that may sound. Preston turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. Don't sound selfish to me, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Sound like exactly what I needed to hear. They remained like that for a moment, connected by touch and shared understanding. Then, with reluctance, Preston withdrew his hand and stood, offering Nora assistance to her feet. Better head back, he said. Still need to cook these fish. They walked back to the teacherage in comfortable silence. The air between them changed, somehow clearer, perhaps, now that Preston had shared something of his past. At her door, he hesitated. Would you? That is, I could cook these for you, if you'd like company for supper. Nora smiled, opening her door wide in invitation. I'd like that very much. Inside, Preston proved to be a competent cook, preparing the fish with herbs he'd brought in his saddlebag. Nora contributed potatoes from her small garden and fresh bread she'd baked that morning. They ate by lamplight, their conversation easy, punctuated by comfortable silences. As Preston prepared to leave that evening, Nora walked him to the door. Thank you for today, she said. For everything. He turned to face her, his hat in his hands. In the soft lamplight, his eyes were dark and intent on her face. Nora, he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words. She waited, her heart beating faster at something in his expression. I'm not good at this, he said finally. At saying what I feel, but today by the river. I felt more peace than I have in years. I felt it too, Nora admitted. Preston took a small step closer. When I pulled you from that flood, I had no idea. He shook his head as if amazed by his own thoughts. No idea that saving you would save something in me too. Nora's breath caught at the rawness in his voice, the vulnerability in his usually guarded expression. Preston, she whispered, not knowing what else to say, slowly giving her time to step away if she wished. He raised one hand to cup her cheek. His touch was warm, calloused, but gentle. Nora leaned into it, her eyes never leaving his. May I call on you properly? He asked, his voice low. Not just as a friend helping out, but with intention. Nora's heart soared at the formal request, so characteristic of Preston's careful nature. Yes, she said, covering his hand with hers. I'd like that very much. The smile that transformed his face was breathtaking in its openness. For a moment, Nora saw the man he might have been had life dealt him a gentler hand, the carefree youth before war and loss had shaped him. With careful deliberation, Preston leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture both chaste and profoundly intimate. Good night, Nora Ellis, he murmured against her skin. Good night, Preston Walker, she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. He stepped back, settling his hat on his head, but his eyes remained on hers. "I'll see you Sunday, at church," Nora nodded. "I'll save you a seat." With a final nod, Preston turned and walked into the summer night, his stride more buoyant than when he had arrived. Nora watched until he disappeared around the corner, then closed her door, leaning against it as a smile spread across her face. Mercury, the kitten, wound around her ankles, meowing for attention. Nora scooped him up, burying her face in his soft fur. "Well, Mercury," she whispered, "it seems your namesake's master has stolen my heart." The kitten purred in response, kneading tiny paws against her shoulder. As promised, Preston sat beside Nora in church that Sunday, causing a flutter of whispers among the congregation. Reverend Carter preached on rebuilding after trials, a theme that resonated deeply with many in Monticello after the spring's devastation. "Our faith is tested not when things go well," the Reverend intoned, "but when the floods come, when our foundations are shaken. It is then that we discover what we are truly built upon." Nora felt Preston's hand find hers on the pew between them, his fingers lacing through hers with quiet assurance. She didn't look at him, keeping her gaze forward, but she squeezed his hand gently in acknowledgement. After the service, they walked together to the community dinner held on the church grounds. Preston was more talkative than usual, greeting townspeople with genuine warmth, even joking with Sheriff Tanner about a recent poker game at the saloon. "Never seen Walker so sociable, Mrs." Peterson commented to Nora as they arranged food on the long tables. "You've been good for him." Nora watched Preston help an elderly Mr. Simmons to a seat in the shade. "I think we've been good for each other," she said softly. The summer progressed, bringing changes to Nora's life that she could never have anticipated in the aftermath of the flood. Preston called on her regularly, their courtship conducted with proper decorum but growing affection. They rode together on Sundays after church, dined with the Petersons and other friends, and spent quiet evenings on the teacherage porch, talking or sometimes just sitting in companionable silence. By August, when Emma Peterson married and departed for Colorado, Nora was fully prepared to take over the schoolhouse. She approached her new responsibilities with enthusiasm, decorating the classroom, organizing lessons, and visiting families to introduce herself to new students. Preston supported her endeavors with quiet pride, often stopping by to help with physical tasks like moving desks or hanging new maps. The children, already familiar with him from his work around town, took to calling him Mr. Walker with a formality that made Nora smile. "They admire you," she told him one evening as they walked back from the schoolhouse. "Especially the boys. Johnny Miller says he wants to be a cowboy just like you when he grows up." Preston looked embarrassed but pleased. "Could do worse, I suppose, though teaching's a finer profession." "Both have their merits," Nora said diplomatically. "The world needs all kinds." Preston's hand found hers as they walked, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Been thinking," he said after a moment. "A dangerous pastime," Nora teased. He smiled at that, the easy smile that now came more frequently to his face. "Maybe so, but I've been thinking about the future." Nora's heart quickened. "Oh," they reached the teacherage, but instead of saying goodnight as usual, Preston gestured to the porch steps. "Can we sit a spell?" Nora nodded, settling beside him on the steps. The evening was warm, the air heavy with the scent of late summer flowers and distant rain. Crickets chirped in the darkness, and a half-moon cast soft light over the yard. Preston removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Nora had come to recognize as nervousness. "Benson's offered me a partnership," he said. "Small stake in the Double Creek operation." "Preston, that's wonderful," Nora exclaimed. "You've certainly earned it." He nodded, turning the hat in his hands. Means I'd have more responsibility, more stability too. I'm so happy for you, Nora said, genuinely pleased. Preston had worked tirelessly at the ranch, often taking on the most difficult tasks without complaint. This recognition was well deserved. Thing is, Preston continued, his voice dropping lower, it also means I'd be in a position to build something of my own. A home, I mean. Nora's breath caught as she began to understand the direction of his thoughts. Been saving these past years, he went on. Not much to spend money on out here. Got enough for a modest place. Land to the east of town, up on the rise where the view stretches all the way to the mountains. It sounds lovely, Nora said softly. Preston turned to face her fully, his expression serious yet tender. Wouldn't mean much without someone to share it with. Nora's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Preston. I know it hasn't been that long, he said quickly. Maybe I'm rushing things, but when you've lost as much as we both have, you learn that time's precious. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing something small that caught the moonlight. This was my mother's, he said, holding up a simple gold band. Only thing I saved from the farm, been carrying it ever since, waiting for. Well, for you, though I didn't know it then. Nora felt tears well in her eyes as Preston took her hand in his. Nora Ellis, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. I love you. Have since the moment I pulled you from that flood and saw the courage in your eyes. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The simplicity and sincerity of his proposal touched Nora deeply. This was not a man given to flowery declarations or grand gestures, but one whose word was his bond, whose action spoke louder than any eloquence could. Yes, she whispered, her vision blurring with happy tears. Yes, Preston Walker, I will marry you. His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly loose, but Nora closed her hand tightly around it, determined not to lose this precious link to Preston's past. We can have it sized, he said, noticing her gesture. No, Nora said firmly. It's perfect as it is, just like you, Preston laughed softly. Far from perfect, perfect for me, she insisted, reaching up to touch his face. And that's what matters. He leaned into her touch, then gently pulled her closer. Their first kiss was tender, a promise sealed between them under the vast Utah sky. When they parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers. Never thought I'd find happiness again, he murmured. Not after everything. Nora understood completely. Nor I, yet here we are. Here we are, he agreed, wonder in his voice. They sat together on the porch steps for a long time, planning their future in quiet voices while stars wheeled overhead. A home on the rise east of town, close enough for Nora to continue teaching, at least for a while. A small herd of cattle to start, with Preston's share in Double Creek providing stability while they built something of their own. What about children? Nora asked, her head resting on Preston's shoulder. She felt him smile. Hope so. Always wanted a family. Me too, Nora admitted. A boy with your eyes, perhaps. A girl with your courage. Your courage, Preston corrected. Never seen anyone as brave as you, standing on that porch with your cabin about to wash away, still thinking about what to save. Nora thought about that day, the terror, the loss, but also the beginning of something precious. The flood took much from me, she said thoughtfully. But it gave me you. A fair trade, I'd say. Preston's arm tightened around her. More than fair, he murmured into her hair. They married in October, when the aspen trees turned gold against the mountains, and the air carried the first crisp hint of winter. The ceremony was held in Monticello's small church, filled to capacity with townspeople who had watched their courtship with approval, and no small amount of romantic satisfaction. Nora wore a simple dress of ivory silk ordered from a catalog and modified by Mrs. Peterson's skillful hands. Around her neck hung the silver locket Preston had given her, containing the pictures of her parents. In her hands, she carried wildflowers gathered that morning from the meadow where their new home was being built. Preston stood tall in a new suit, his usually weathered face clean-shaven for the occasion, his eyes never leaving Nora as she walked toward him on Mr. Peterson's arm. The older man had agreed to give her away, a gesture that moved Nora deeply. Their vows were straightforward, spoken with clear voices that carried to the back of the church. Preston had worried about finding the right words, but when the moment came, he spoke from his heart with a quiet eloquence that brought tears to many eyes. "Nora, you came into my life like a miracle I never thought to ask for. I promise to cherish you, protect you, and stand beside you through whatever storms may come. My heart, my hands, and my future are yours from this day forward." Nora's response was equally heartfelt. "Preston, you saved more than my life that day at the river. You saved my hope, my faith in goodness. I promise to honor you, support you, and love you with all that I am. Wherever life takes us, we'll face it together from this day forward." Reverend Carter pronounced them husband and wife with evident satisfaction. Preston's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, and the church erupted in applause as they turned to face their community as a married couple. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed twice the number present. Preston surprised everyone, including Nora, by leading her confidently in a waltz, his usually reserved demeanor giving way to quiet happiness. "Where did you learn to dance?" Nora asked as they moved across the floor, aware of smiling faces watching them. "Practiced," Preston admitted, a slight flush on his cheeks. "Mrs. Peterson helped, wanted to do right by you today." The thought of her stoic cowboy secretly practicing dance steps with the motherly Mrs. Peterson filled Nora with tenderness. "You always do right by me," she assured him. "Always." Their new home wasn't quite finished, so they spent their wedding night in a room at Monticello's small hotel, prepared specially for them by the owner's wife with fresh linens and wildflowers. Preston carried Nora across the threshold as tradition demanded, setting her gently on her feet in the center of the room. For a moment, they stood looking at each other, the reality of their new status as husband and wife suddenly present in the intimate space. Then Preston reached out, slowly unpinning Nora's hair, watching as it fell in waves around her shoulders. "Beautiful," he murmured, running his fingers through the auburn strands. "Been wanting to see it like this since that first morning at the line shack when it dried all wild around your face." Nora smiled, remembering her embarrassment then, how she tried to tame her hair with her fingers. "I must have looked a fright." "You looked alive," Preston corrected. "Most beautiful sight I'd ever seen." That night, they discovered each other with tender patience, Preston's inherent gentleness matched by Nora's trust in him. Their love, already strong through shared experience and growing affection, deepened in the physical expression of their commitment. Afterward, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Nora traced the scar along Preston's jawline. "How did you get this?" she asked. "Barbed wire," he replied, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "First year out west, still learning the ropes, literal ones in that case." Nora smiled, then grew more serious. "And this?" Her fingers drifted to a puckered scar on his shoulder, visible now that she could see him fully. Preston was quiet for a moment. "Shiloh," he said finally. "Confederate sharpshooter. Lucky shot went clean through." Nora leaned down to press her lips to the mark of that long-ago violence. "Not luck," she murmured against his skin. "Providence. God knew I would need you someday." Preston pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "Never thought of it that way," he admitted. "Makes it easier to bear somehow." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the past's pain softened by present joy and future promise. The following weeks were busy ones as they settled into married life. Preston divided his time between his duties at Double Creek and completing their new home, while Nora continued teaching during the week. Evenings and weekends were spent together, establishing rhythms and routines as a couple. Their house, modest but well built on the rise east of town, was ready for occupancy by Thanksgiving. Preston had insisted on certain features that surprised Nora: large windows to catch the morning light, bookshelves built into the walls of the front room, and a spacious kitchen with a view of the mountains. "Never knew you had such an eye for detail," Nora remarked as they arranged furniture in their new home. Preston shrugged, though she could see he was pleased by her approval. "Wanted it to be right for you, a place where you'd be happy." "I'd be happy in a tent if you were with me," Nora assured him, earning a rare laugh and a kiss that delayed their unpacking considerably. Mercury the kitten, now a half-grown cat, explored the new house with feline curiosity, eventually claiming a sunny spot on the bedroom windowsill as his preferred perch. Preston, who had initially seemed indifferent to the cat, was often found slipping him treats or absent-mindedly stroking his fur while reading in the evenings. Winter descended on Utah territory with characteristic severity. Heavy snows isolated Monticello for days at a time, but Nora and Preston found comfort in their snug home. They established traditions of their own reading aloud to each other in the evenings, Sunday dinners with friends when weather permitted, and long conversations by the fire about their past lives and future dreams. Preston spoke more openly now about his family and his experiences during the war, sharing memories both painful and precious. Nora, in turn, told him stories of her parents, keeping their memory alive through anecdotes that made them real to her husband. "Your father would have approved of you," she told him one snowy evening as they sat before the hearth. "He valued honesty and hard work above all." Preston smiled, his arm around her shoulders. "And your mother, what would she have thought of me?" Nora considered this, her head resting against him. "She would have loved you for loving me," she said simply, "and for building me bookshelves without being asked." He laughed softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Smart woman, your mother." When spring arrived, melting snow swelled the rivers once again, though not to the devastating levels of the previous year. Still, Preston watched the water levels with vigilance, riding out daily to check on neighbors in low-lying areas. On the anniversary of the flood that had brought them together, Preston took Nora to the spot where her cabin had once stood. The land had recovered remarkably, new grass grew where mud had been, and wildflowers dotted the riverside. "Thought you might want to visit," he explained as they dismounted. "For closure." Nora walked slowly to where her front porch had been, now indistinguishable from the surrounding ground except in her memory. She knelt, running her fingers through the new grass. "It's strange," she said as Preston came to stand beside her. "I can still see it so clearly in my mind, yet there's nothing left." "Not nothing," Preston corrected gently. "The land is still here, still yours." Nora looked up at him, shielding her eyes from the spring sunshine. "What are you thinking, Preston Walker?" He helped her to her feet, his expression thoughtful. "Thinking it might be good land for an orchard. Cherry trees, maybe, like the one your father planted." Emotion welled in Nora's throat at the suggestion. "You do that?" "We would," Preston said, emphasizing the word. "Together. A way to honor your parents, make something new from what was lost." Nora threw her arms around his neck, overcome by the perfect rightness of the idea. Preston held her close, his strength a constant she had come to rely on. "I love you," she whispered against his shoulder. "So very much." "And I you," he replied, the simple declaration carrying the weight of all they had survived together. They began planting the orchard the following week, starting with a single cherry tree in the exact spot where Nora's father's tree had stood. As they worked side by side, digging holes for saplings and carefully setting the young trees, Nora felt a sense of continuity, of life persisting despite loss. That summer brought another change to their lives, one that filled them both with joy and trepidation. Nora's monthly courses failed to appear, and Dr. Simmons confirmed what she had begun to suspect. "A baby," Preston said when she told him, wonder and fear mingling in his voice. "By Christmas, you said." Nora nodded, watching his face carefully. "Are you happy about it?" For answer, Preston gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an uncharacteristic display of exuberance. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said when he set her down, his hand still at her waist. "Terrified too, if I'm honest, but mostly grateful. So grateful, Nora." They agreed she would finish the school term before relinquishing her teaching position. The school committee expressed regret at losing her, but understood her desire to focus on motherhood. A replacement was found, a young woman from Grand Junction, with teaching experience and a willingness to relocate to Monticello. As Nora's body changed with pregnancy, Preston's protectiveness increased. He took on more help at the ranch and orchard to ensure he could be home each night, and he insisted on accompanying her whenever she ventured far from town. Nora bore his concern with good humor, knowing it stemmed from love and his own history of loss. "The baby and I are perfectly fine," she assured him repeatedly. "Women have been having children since the beginning of time." "Not my child," Preston would reply stubbornly. "Not my wife." The entire community seemed invested in Nora's pregnancy. Women brought gifts of baby clothes and blankets, offered advice, solicited and otherwise, and included her in the time-honored traditions of preparation for childbirth. Men clapped Preston on the back and teased him good-naturedly about sleepless nights to come, while secretly organizing to build a cradle as a surprise. As winter approached again, Nora's time grew near. Dr. Simmons visited regularly to check her progress, declaring both mother and child to be in excellent health. Mrs. Peterson, who had assisted at many births, promised to be present when Nora's time came. "First babies often take their time arriving," she told Nora during a visit in early December. "But when this little one decides to come, we'll be ready." 2 weeks before Christmas, on a clear, cold night when stars seemed to hang just above the mountains, Nora woke to the first pains of labor. She touched Preston's shoulder, rousing him from sleep. "It's time," she said simply. The calm certainty in her voice belied the anxiety Preston felt as he hurried to saddle his horse and ride for Dr. Simmons and Mrs. Peterson. By the time they returned, Nora had prepared the bedroom, laying out clean linens and the baby clothes she had sewn with such care over the previous months. Labor progressed steadily through the night and into the following day. Preston, initially banished to the front room as was customary, refused to stay away, insisting on remaining by Nora's side despite Mrs. Peterson's scandalized objections. "My place is with my wife," he said firmly, taking Nora's hand as another contraction gripped her. Dr. Simmons, more progressive in his thinking, allowed it. "Might do her good to have him here," he told Mrs. Peterson. "Seen it work that way before." Nora drew strength from Preston's presence, focusing on his steady voice and unwavering support as the pain intensified. When it seemed unbearable, when she felt she couldn't continue, he reminded her of the flood they had survived together. "You're stronger than any force of nature," he told her, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "You can do this, Nora. I believe in you." As the winter sun began to set on December 13, 1876, Nora gave the final push that brought their son into the world. The baby's lusty cry filled the room, bringing tears to both parents' eyes. "A fine boy," Dr. Simmons announced, cleaning and wrapping the infant before placing him in Nora's arms. "Strong lungs on that one." Nora cradled her son, overwhelmed by the perfect tiny features, the dark hair that already showed signs of Preston's waves, the miniature fingers that curled reflexively around her own. "He's beautiful," she whispered, looking up at Preston, who sat beside her on the bed, one arm supporting her shoulders. Preston reached out, gently touching the baby's cheek with a finger that seemed enormous compared to the infant's face. "Perfect," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Like his mother." They named him Samuel James Walker Samuel, after Nora's father, James after Preston's. As news of the birth spread through Monticello, visitors began to arrive, bearing gifts and good wishes for the newest member of the community. Preston took to fatherhood with natural ease that surprised everyone except Nora. He held Samuel confidently, walked the floor with him during fussy nights, and spoke to him in the same serious tone he used with adults, explaining ranch operations or reading from whatever book Nora had left open. "He won't understand any of that for years," Nora pointed out one evening as Preston detailed cattle breeding practices to their 2-week-old son. Preston smiled, not looking up from Samuel's intent gaze. "Never too early to learn important things. Besides, he likes the sound of my voice." Settles him. It was true. Samuel seemed especially responsive to his father, often calming immediately when Preston held him. The bond between them was beautiful to witness, easing any lingering doubts Nora might have harbored about Preston's adjustment to family life after so many years of solitude. As Christmas approached, they prepared to celebrate their first holiday as a family of 3. Preston cut a small pine tree from their land and set it up in the front room, while Nora decorated it with ornaments donated by neighbors and friends. On Christmas Eve, with Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle beside them, they exchanged gifts by the fire's light. Preston gave Nora a rocking chair he had commissioned from Mr. Jacobson, the town's woodworker, its smooth curves and comfortable seat perfect for nursing and soothing their son. Nora's gift to Preston was smaller but equally meaningful, a pocket watch to replace the one he had lost years before. Inside the case, she had placed a small photograph of herself holding Samuel, their faces clear beneath the protective glass. "So you'll always have us with you," she explained as Preston examined the watch with wonder. "Even when duties take you away from home." Preston closed the watch carefully, then pulled Nora into his arms. "Best Christmas of my life," he murmured against her hair. "Best year of my life, come to that." Nora smiled, leaning into his embrace. "And many more to come," she promised. Over the following years, the Walker family flourished alongside their cherry orchard. Samuel grew into a sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful nature. He was joined 2 years later by a sister, Emma Rose, whose arrival was considerably quicker and less dramatic than her brother's had been. Preston's partnership in the Double Creek Ranch prospered, allowing them to expand their own holdings. The cherry trees began to bear fruit, providing a supplementary income and becoming known throughout the region for their quality. Nora, while focused primarily on raising their children, found time to tutor students who needed extra help and to write occasional articles for the territorial newspaper about education and frontier life. Their home expanded as their family grew, with Preston adding rooms as needed, always with an eye toward Nora's comfort and preferences. The bookshelves filled with volumes ordered from Denver and Salt Lake City, creating a library that became the envy of Monticello. Through the changing seasons and passing years, they remained each other's constant. The bond formed during those desperate moments in the flood waters deepened with shared joys and sorrows, with quiet evenings and busy days, with the thousand small moments that constitute a life built together. On warm summer evenings, they often sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. During one such evening, as Samuel and Emma chased fireflies in the gathering dusk, Preston took Nora's hand in his. "You ever think about it?" he asked. The flood, how different things might have been. Nora considered the question, her gaze on their children healthy, happy, secure in the knowledge they were loved. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with regret." Preston nodded, understanding what she meant. The flood had taken much from Nora, yet without it, they might never have found each other, never built this life that, despite its occasional hardships, was rich beyond measure. "The cabin my father built was precious to me," Nora continued, leaning against Preston's shoulder. "But what we've built together is stronger. It would take more than a flood to wash it away." Preston pressed a kiss to her temple, his arm tightening around her. "Nothing's going to wash it away," he promised. "Not while I have breath in my body." They sat together as darkness fell, the mountains fading to silhouettes against the star-filled sky. Samuel and Emma, tired from their play, came to sit at their parents' feet, the family complete in their contentment. In that moment, with her husband beside her and their children safe, Nora thought again of that terrifying day when flood waters had surrounded her cabin. What had seemed like an ending had been, in truth, a beginning, the first chapter in a story more beautiful than she could have imagined. A story of love born in crisis, tested by challenge and strengthened by shared purpose. A story still unfolding, day by day, season by season, in the life they had built together in the shadow of Utah's mountains. A story of a cowboy who had swum through churning waters to save her, and in doing so, had saved himself as well.